On February 8th, 2024, democracy was reborn, and gaming would never be the same. Helldivers 2 is a game that requires very little introduction, as its reputation precedes itself. When it released in February of this year, Helldivers 2 quickly took over the gaming landscape, and for good reason. But in case you know nothing about Helldivers 2, let me give you a quick and dirty rundown. Helldivers 2 is a game developed by Arrowhead Game Studios that sees you take up the role of the titular Helldiver, an elite infantry unit that dives from orbital drop pods straight into the thick of combat to terminate anything that could potentially pose a threat to democracy and Super Earth, your home. And you do so by using a handful of unique weapons you choose to bring into battle as you lay waste to your enemies. You team up with pals, take on the enemy, and complete your objective as you and your fellow Helldivers move one step closer to protecting democracy. It's a very simple game, but that's part of its charm. If you were active in the gaming scene around February, this is probably the only game you heard about at that time, as it was blowing up just about everywhere on social media. It was incredibly popular because it felt like a game released outside of this generation. It was fun, it was silly, it was engaging, until it wasn't. Helldivers has had a rough 10 months since release. The game has gone through a massive initial success, a slow and brutal downfall, and now a brand new renaissance as of the most recent patch that has restored it to its former glory. And so I felt like it was time to document the comeback of one of gaming's most unique titles, much like I did with Concord last month. Because much like Concord, Helldivers 2 has one fatal flaw. It is a live service game, a game that lives and dies by the hands of its developers. And I feel it's best to condense all of the major milestones the game has gone through, so we as a community have something that documents what the game was like during that time. So let's take a look into the already storied development history and reception of Helldivers 2 after just 10 months of release. There is a lot to cover, as this is a game that always has something going on, but I'll try my best to cover all of the major events in detail. So hit those like and subscribe buttons down below if you want to see more videos like this in the future. Ready up, and let's dive, baby. We start at February 8th. Launch day for Helldivers 2. This was a busy time for the developers over at Arrowhead Studios. With a studio of only 100 devs at time of launch, the success they saw with the release of Helldivers 2 was unprecedented in almost every way for a team of that size. The game launched in such a successful state that the servers were overloaded for about a week straight as the game reached an all-time player peak of nearly 500,000 players, not including the ones on PSN. The game was blowing up just about everywhere. On Steam, on PlayStation, on TikTok, on Reddit. People wanted to play, and word of mouth was only making the problem worse. So they were, in all essence, suffering from success. Arrowhead pushed out patches almost every other day in the month of February as a result to try and keep pace with the demand for the game. This kind of success is usually reserved for MMOs that are supposed to have an absurd amount of concurrent players, not a squad-based co-op shooter. To give you an idea of how successful it was, Helldivers 2 sold 12 million copies after just 3 months of release. Not only is it the best-selling game in PlayStation history, but it also succeeded as a game in its own right. As I mentioned earlier, it has a simplistic charm that many found reminiscent of co-op multiplayer games of old, like Halo 3 and Left 4 Dead. It's a game that harkens back to when games were just fun for the sake of it. You and a group of buddies team up, wreak havoc on whatever bug or automaton waddles into your path, or die trying. It's a game that doesn't take itself too seriously in an era where every game is either a hyper-competitive PvP shooter or a repetitive AAA slop with barely any game underneath the pretty exterior. And in the year 2024, it felt like newly released games tended to forget that fun is the most vital ingredient to making a game playable. I don't know how many times I need to say it, but it's just a fun game, and people flock to it in droves because of that very reason. The game took off on social media in ways I've only seen happen to a few games before, and the players did much of the marketing themselves because the game was just that fun to play and watch. It's kind of the Baldur's Gate 3 approach, where word of mouth and social media helped the game to become bigger and bigger than it was ever imagined to be. Many Many people touted it as their Game of the Year contender despite how early it was released in the year, and for good reason. Helldivers 2 managed to capture the feeling of being a soldier in the middle of an active war zone through some of the most visceral combat gaming has ever seen. It's fast, it's brutal, and it's intimate. Guns have weight as the recoil from firing sends the reticle flying away from the center of the screen. Explosions can send you flying and destroy just about everything they come into contact with. And your diver has a real sense of presence on the field as everything they touch reacts accordingly. The worlds you take to also feel very real thanks to some really impressive lighting and volumetric fog that makes the space feel authentic and alive. It seeps atmosphere through every open crater, and the game wants you to feel like you're in the middle of an active combat zone on a hostile enemy planet, and it succeeds in just about every way possible. The game is about cooperation in every sense, and it encourages you and your fellow Helldivers to help each other in fun and unique ways. And it was funny to boot, because the game made the act of failure, the act of friendly fire, part of the experience.
Dap me up.
Just a phone. Wait.
Friendly fire is also a massive part of what makes Helldivers the game it is and adds to the visceral nature of the combat. No one is safe from your bullets or gas or explosions because Helldivers are made from glass bones and paper skin. Even the slightest nick can lead to a bum arm or broken leg, and when characters scream out, "Sweet liberty, my leg!" in such dramatic fashion, it just adds to the comedy. These soldiers are unhinged in the thick of combat, and I can't get enough of it. Freedom never rests! Freedom! So despite early server launch woes, it became an instant classic in the pantheons of co-op PvE games alongside Deep Rock Galactic, Left 4 Dead, and many others. It's a one-of-a-kind game that captures lightning in a bottle. Everything felt perfect, or as close to perfect as it could get. As players continued to enjoy the game through February, March is already here, and the honeymoon period is starting to wane on the game as the players are progressing through the game maybe a little faster than Arrowhead had expected. Since they've been busy fixing server launch issues and working on refining the game, there hasn't been any new content introduced. Server issues are finally starting to calm, but now Arrowhead has a new problem on their hands. The players exhausted the content quickly, and they were insatiable. They wanted more fast. Thankfully, Arrowhead came prepared and already had stuff in the oven ready for deployment as they introduced a new mission type as well as a new premium war bond. War bonds are the game's way of introducing new content in a manageable format, with new ones launching almost every month. These include new weapons, armors, and even new stratagems that can be used in the thick of combat. Stratagems are similar to abilities in other games, where the player is required to input a combo in order to summon things like drones, mech suits, airstrikes, and just about anything with great lethality to you and your teammates. So we can think of these war bonds kind of like a battle pass, but they don't disappear once the month is over. They are permanently added to the game for players to unlock either by buying them with premium currency or by finding said premium currency out in the field. Another reason for the game's success was its use of live service that hasn't been replicated by any other game. Helldivers 2 uses live service in a very unique way, where the people playing the game take an active role in how the universe, story, and game progresses, all while a dedicated person behind the scenes crafts the narrative around the successes and failures of the Helldivers. As players liberate planets and complete game-wide objectives called major orders, events will happen in-universe that will change the course of the game. It not only serves the purpose as a storytelling mechanism in the universe, but it also lets the player base work together to unlock new weapons that they can use on the battlefield. One major order that we saw take place early in March was the assault on Tien, where the automatons had seized control of the planet and also the control of factories that were producing exosuits that Helldivers could call into battle. And so a major order was established, letting Helldivers take to the planet to regain the means of production for the exosuits. And once the Helldivers completed the objective, they received the ability to call in these exosuits into battle. Another major order that took place in March was the introduction introduction of a new mission type, one that saw the Helldivers take to the planet Meridia to activate a new type of tower that acted as a type of insecticide, spewing poisonous gas that is supposed to kill all of the bugs on the planet and neutralize it as a potential threat in the future. The Helldivers succeeded with flying colors, managing to turn on all of the insecticide towers to wipe out the bug infestation, but this won't be the last time we hear from Meridia in the future. Major orders are this brilliant case where the game and developers work hand in hand to tell this narrative that can change at a moment's notice. When major orders don't get completed, as they can sometimes be fairly difficult, the developers have to make changes accordingly. If the players win all the time, there's no challenge. There's no investment in the narrative. And the way Helldivers 2 utilizes the live service genre in unique ways is what sets it apart from other games on the market. It's a game where the in-game universe is actively changing and evolving every week. It incentivizes players to get invested into the narrative, leading to new and interesting places for the developers to explore, so the game marches on, a universe full of secrets to unravel and orders to complete. Arrowhead made sure to keep the Helldivers busy through March. However, as April rolls around, there are issues starting to pop up as the game progresses. At the end of the month, the game saw a sweeping balance patch that affected nearly every gun in the game's existing arsenal. This included nerfing many guns that were determined to be part of the meta, but also buffing others. This balance patch rubbed quite a few players the wrong way. Why were they nerfing weapons in a PvE game? Well, like any live service game, the game itself lives and dies by the cadence at which its balance is updated. And with each new war bond added to the game, that introduces about 4 new weapons and armors that will require balancing. And when new weapons are introduced, said weapons are inherently going to be stronger than what came before because the developers want people to buy the new weapons and try them out. A live service isn't a live service unless there's something to monetize after all. So that means that Arrowhead will be nerfing weapons that came before, and we're already starting to see a worrying trend appear with the game balance. Let's just say, for math's sake, that we get 4 new weapons introduced each month with every new warbond. That's 48 weapons for each year that Helldivers 2 will be active, and Arrowhead will be forced to balance as the game continues to develop, and power creep will become ever more apparent as time moves on. Some weapon choices will inherently be better than others as they offer benefits that some weapons can't, and the devs are starting to set themselves up for failure in terms of how many guns require balancing, and it's starting to feel like a powder keg that's growing in size as time goes on. The more variables added to the game, the more likely things are to go wrong. Balance is a very tricky tightrope to walk, which is something that Arrowhead knows very well, as it became a point of contention very early on in the game's life. Their patching philosophy states that every gun needs to have a purpose, and that will determine its use case going forward. So there are some guns that are better at dealing with mobs and some that are just better at dealing with heavily armored units. Weapons cannot be too strong and too versatile because it plays a part in how the meta develops. Alex K, the game balancer on Helldivers 2, had this to say over the nerfs we saw in the late April update, saying, quote, "Weapons that are both powerful and versatile become a no-brainer choice during the weapon selection phase. It robs you of your own agency as stale meta builds force you to make an unfair choice between a fun weapon and an effective one. In short, powerful weapons can't be too versatile weapons can't be too powerful," end quote. Which I couldn't agree more with. There should never be a one-size-fits-all solution when you're posed with a problem in-game, because it forces players to play a certain way if they want to succeed, meaning that there is little to no fun allowed. Instead, it should be more focused on letting the players play in ways they want to, and letting them have agency and fun at the same time. And sometimes that means being the villain and nerfing certain weapons that put them in line with others. They also understand that nobody really likes nerfs. Alex again goes on to say, quote, "I know that having your favorite toy nerfed absolutely sucks. Investing countless hours into mastering a weapon is an incredible dedication from you, which is the main reason we're making this game in the first place. And then having that weapon weakened feels like a punishment for being too good at the game. But I implore you not to compare a changed item with its older version," end quote. Which is an odd statement. Saying that you shouldn't compare what you have now to what came before isn't really something people can do. People are used to what they have now, and trying to change them into fitting into the holes you designed isn't really conducive to a good gameplay experience. It's giving you think you do, but you don't energy. Not a good look. So balance is already a pretty tricky subject early on in the game's development. Maybe not the best first couple months, but things are still going relatively well. And wouldn't you know it, soon after that massive balance balance patch dropped, the Helldivers were informed of an interesting development. Remember those insecticide towers we set up in March? The ones spewing gas all over? Yeah, well, turns out that gas is actually making the bugs stronger by mutating them, so time to go deactivate those now. So as the Helldivers took to Meridia once more to turn off the towers, bigger problems would soon be on the horizon. And by big, I mean monumental. Some more time has passed and we're sitting in early May now. Player numbers have expectedly declined pretty naturally, and the game is doing okay despite those early balance patch frustrations. In fact, I'd say the game is doing quite well around this time. Most live service games don't reach numbers even close to what Helldivers had, so even if player counts drop slowly, that's no skin off the game's back. But turns out that the game's biggest threat wouldn't be balancing or updates or content, but instead an entirely external force, one that wanted to have its cake and eat it too: Sony. For some context, Helldivers 2 is, of course, a PlayStation game. While Sony does not own Arrowhead, Helldivers 2 still uses PlayStation servers and infrastructure to operate the game. So Sony, in their infinite wisdom, decided that since they published the game, and the game runs exclusively on their servers, that every copy of Helldivers 2 should be attached to a PlayStation Network ID. It also allows them to do player moderation in terms of banning bad actors and griefers from the game. Now, it sounds reasonable at first. Helldivers 2 is a console exclusive to PlayStation. Makes sense that you should have a PSN account to play the game, as you can't even buy the game without a PSN account on the console. But Sony made one itty bitty mistake by making this decision. They released the game day and date on PC as well, which is a brand new move for them. See, here's the thing about PC gamers. They hate being told that they have to log into a game publisher's stupid proprietary network in order to play their games. They hate downloading other clients and making accounts. They just want to play games on Steam, and that's it. PC gamers are used to buying a game and downloading it and playing it. They don't need more bloatware to just play a game. The requirement for PSN also came with it a caveat, as Sony only allows the creation of PSN accounts in one of 69 countries. Nice. But there are about 190 countries in the world, and Sony also has a stipulation in their terms of service for PSN stating that they reserve the right to suspend, terminate, or restrict any account, including as stated in section 12.2 of this agreement, that uses or was created using false information or that we determine was created or used for a purpose that violates this agreement. So that meant that people playing their imported PlayStations in countries that don't allow for the creation of PSN accounts wouldn't be able to play the game anymore. See the problem? Many people felt that Sony was overstepping their bounds by enforcing the PSN requirement, meaning that people in countries without PSN wouldn't be able to play anymore. So the players took up arms to fight for their fellow Helldivers, and they had numbers on their side. In frankly a very beautiful act of solidarity, players collectively made their voices known in one of the only ways they know how, and review bombing the game on Steam, plunging the game from overwhelmingly positive to mostly negative over the course of just a few days. Sony had never had a game succeed like Helldivers, so they had two options. One being to ruin their biggest success in terms of sales and let the game die, or two, concede to the whims of the people and let the players win. It felt like a fruitless battle. Sony is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Why would they listen to the players? But Arrowhead worked hand in hand with the community that they have worked diligently alongside since the game's release, and convinced Sony that this simply wasn't the play that they thought it was. The players want the game to succeed, and so does Arrowhead. So both of those parties relented, and if Sony knows what's good for them, they will back down and let the game be. And thus, Sony relented, but not until after the damage was done. A tweet sent out by PlayStation on May 5th said the following, quote, "Helldivers fans, we've heard your feedback on the Helldivers 2 account linking update. The May 6th update, which would have required Steam and PlayStation Network account linking for new players and for current players beginning May 30th, will not be moving forward. We are still learning what is best for PC players, and your feedback has been invaluable. Thanks again for your continued support of Helldivers 2, and we'll keep you updated on future plans," end quote. This small, seemingly inconsequential action had irreparably damaged the game's good reputation and left a scar on the body that will never fade. The players are upset. Arrowhead isn't in a good position. Now we're sitting cautiously in early May after the PSN debacle, and the reputational damage to the game has been done. With thousands of angry reviews still on the Steam page, this leaves Arrowhead behind to pick up the scattered remains of their project. So they put their heads down and worked. but not in ways that were all positive. The delivery cadence of updates had slowed down to about one a month from May to July, as players have continuously trickled from the game following the PSN disaster. But that didn't stop the narrative of Helldivers at all. Going back and turning off those insecticide towers, well, that part didn't go so well. The Helldivers were unable to turn off the towers and the bugs began to dominate the system, so a new plan had to be set into place. The Helldivers were to take to Meridia and begin pumping a special type of liquid, known only as dark fluid, into the planet's crust. And soon after this major order was completed successfully, the planet was not destroyed, but it instead cascaded itself into a black hole, creating a permanent spot on the galactic map with a black hole where the planet once resided. It showed that Arrowhead still had a great level of creative chops behind the team and were never afraid to shake things up on the narrative front. This is only one example of major orders shaking up the game world and having long, persisting effects even months after release. And now this black hole serves as a sort of Chekhov's gun, just sitting there, waiting for its moment to strike in the narrative. Will it be used as a dump, or will it be used as a sort of portal for something else to come through? Who's to say? But I am eagerly awaiting the day when something does happen with it. And even though the patch cadence had slowed recently, that didn't stop the patches themselves from being so beefy. The patches for the months of May and June listed cavalcades of changes related to enemies, stratagems, bug fixing, and of course, balancing. The goal with these monumental patches was to instead buff poorly performing stratagems and weapons to put them more in line with more powerful weaponry at the Helldivers' disposal. The May patch made it so less powerful weapons had a greater effect on armored enemies, which become more prevalent in the game as the player increases the difficulty levels. But players were starting to make their concerns known to then Arrowhead CEO Johan Pilestedt on Twitter.com that the recent balance patches haven't felt great. It's clear that the players are passionate about the game because they've invested so much time into it, and Johan understands the sentiment that these players are feeling. He responded to a tweet saying, quote, "Hey, yeah, I think we've gone too far in some areas. We'll talk to the team about the approach to balance. It feels like every time someone finds something fun, the fun is removed," end quote. The developers at Arrowhead clearly care about the game and its players. The players very much feel the same way. You have to put yourself into the shoes of both sides when observing this phenomenon at that time. Arrowhead wants people to be involved in the game, so they take to media platforms like Twitter and Discord to get input on patches and such, but they also need to ensure that the creative vision of the game stays intact. The game can't be too easy or else it will lose a lot of its appeal. And we see, especially in that April patch, that the developers were more focused on removing the power of weapons instead of changing certain aspects that give them trade-offs. It's bad balancing at the end of the day, where the devs focus too much on damage instead of altering other parts of the weaponry like reload speeds, amount of mags on hand, amount of bullets per mag, etc. These changes feel a lot better than just changing the damage a weapon can do, but the metaphorical damage has already been done, and now the developers and players have to live with it. But the developers wouldn't be fully aware of how much the community disliked the changes until August, as they spent all of July working on something that they thought was really special behind the scenes. And in August, the game received a major update called the Escalation of Freedom, which touted many new additions to the game, including a new difficulty level, new mission types, new enemy variants, new biomes, as well as another balance update. The escalation didn't just apply to Freedom, but to the state of the game in general. Things weren't looking too good for Helldivers 2 at this point, as player counts had reached a low of around 20,000 players. It was by no means a dead game, as it had player counts similar to other games that it shared a co-op space with, like Deep Rock and Left 4 Dead, but player sentiment was decreasing. With every subsequent update that Arrowhead had made up to that point, the community fell deeper and deeper into despair. They felt that whenever a meta would develop around certain weapons, then those weapons would be nerfed into the ground to make them less useful, making the game more difficult as a result. People would get used to certain weapons and stratagems, and were then forced to change what they like using to instead using something the developer wanted them to use. It took the fun out of the game. No longer did players feel the desire to dive back in, because all Arrowhead did was nerf everything you had. The fan outcry and frustration were at an apex. Arrowhead had stated that the game thrives when it's difficult, which is the the reason behind the nerfs. And that's understandable. Some weapons were clearly stronger than others, so a meta formed around those weapons. They don't want Helldivers to be unkillable weapons of destruction. They want you to be a group against the odds, scrapping and fighting tooth and nail to eke out a win. Using all of the tools at your disposal, you and your team should just barely come out on top because it makes the game that much more enjoyable. That is the game they want to make. And so they nerfed to make the game what they wanted it to be, to make a game that was dangerous and uninviting. Nerfs never feel good to the players, especially in a game that is strictly PvE. Nerfing weapons that players love to use feels like a kick in the shin for those players, and so they spoke out about it. And if you want the players to be involved, then you better be prepared for upsetting them in new ways. Nerfs also played a major part in how the game was evolving to maybe be a little too difficult. With all the nerfs hitting the game, players felt too constrained in using just a handful of useful tools in dealing with enemies because of the way the armor and the armor penetration system worked. If I were to break down the issue into some main points, it would be this. Basically, Helldivers 2 has an armor system for enemies. As enemies go up in size, they get more armor and become more difficult to kill as a result. These bigger units also have armor that covers the majority of their bodies, so there are only a handful of vulnerable weak spots to shoot at. Armor itself isn't the issue. The issue stems from the tools Helldivers had at their disposal to deal with these heavily armored units, as there are only a handful of weapons effective enough to deal with these heavily armored units in an efficient manner. And when you play on higher difficulties, the spawn rate of these heavily armored units becomes much more common, meaning that you have to rely on these select few weapons to actually play the game. It's not a complex issue, but it's one that's only been raised in severity as the developers continued to nerf. So instead of making more weapons viable, they instead exacerbated the problem of making the meta even more present. Players have made themselves heard over the last 6 months, and they're fed up. More negative reviews flooded the Steam page, and discussion on the Discord had begun to devolve into vitriol towards the developers for destroying their Game of the Year contender. The stakes were now elevated, and Arrowhead had to plan something to curb their worried fanbase. So they came up with the idea that they deemed quite plainly the 60-day plan. The goal of the 60-day plan was to overhaul how communication was handled between the player base and Arrowhead. Game director for Helldivers 2, Mikhail E., took to the Steam forums and put out a notice of the 60-day plan with the following introduction, quote, "Fellow Helldivers, I want to directly address the feedback you've raised about the Escalation of Freedom update. We spent the last week listening to feedback, reflecting about the path ahead for Helldivers 2 and how we want to continue developing the game. In short, we didn't hit our target with the latest update. Some things we just didn't get right, and other, more fundamental inconsistencies in our approach to game balance and game direction. All of that is on us, and we are going to own that. As many of you have pointed out, and we agree, what matters most now is action, not talk," end quote, and follows it up with a very substantial plan of everything Arrowhead would be doing from that point going forward. It's a pretty extensive list, I'll give them that. Arrowhead made it clear yet again that they care about the game and its players and are willing to actually put in the work to quell the fears that the players have. But, what do they say? The road to democracy is paved with good intentions or something like that? Well, whatever. I guess we'll see if they can stick true to their word with the 60-day plan as we head into September. As August comes to a close, player counts are still fairly regulated. There haven't been any substantial drops, and it still maintains a healthy amount of players of around 20,000. Again, still not dead, but nowhere near the all-time peak it reached back in February. Arrowhead took to the forums and read just about everything they could to rework the game, and it took them about half a month to put together an update that would dramatically overhaul the game. And on September 17th, the game's biggest patch of all time hit. So big, in fact, that the developers took to making a comprehensive YouTube video showcasing all of the changes made. I'm talking an overhaul to armor penetration, weapon and stratagem balancing, enemy reworks, Helldiver health, the works. There are so many changes listed in the patch that the video itself requires a full 30 minutes to digest in its entirety, and the game feels so much better for it. It's a patch that's too big for me to list out here, shooter, but the goal of the patch was to make different weapons viable again against stronger armor-clad enemies. It allowed for Helldivers to have more options at their disposal when tackling more difficult challenges, and just makes the game more fun to play and experiment with overall. The patch included a massive array of buffs to weapons, either by giving them more ammo or even just increasing their damage, that will make them more efficient in combat against stronger enemies. And this patch was incredibly well received by the community. It didn't fix every problem people had with the game, but it was a massive step in the right direction for the developers and the players. Turns out, when the developers focus on fun rather than balance, the game is much better for it. People came to the game for the fun of it, to accidentally blast their buddies with concentrated explosives, and to seize democracy. And now, the game is back on track. The player numbers on Steam practically doubled after the release. Before the patch, the game was hovering around 10 to 20,000 players, but after the massive patch, player numbers are averaging around 40 to 50k, which is just amazing to see. It finally feels like Helldivers 2 got its groove back, and I am so happy for it. So here we are today. It's October. Time sure does fly, doesn't it? Revisiting Helldivers 2 for this video has reignited my love for it and everything it has to offer. The game, despite all the controversies and troubles it has seen, is still one of the most special and unique co-op experiences I have ever played. It's intense, it's hilarious, it's difficult, and it's just a fun-ass game. No amount of patches will ever change that for me, because everything I mentioned is essential to the game deep to its very core. Helldivers wouldn't be the same if even one of those things was missing, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I know the game has been in a rough spot recently, but the state it's in today feels like the stim in the neck it needed to get back up and fight again another day. There's no telling what the future holds for Helldivers 2. I'm no psychic, but one thing is very true. Helldivers 2 is clearly in good hands. The team at Arrowhead loves the game. They love the community. They have worked diligently over the course of their 60-day plan, which at time of release is almost at completion. The plan has proven to be a success, as Steam reviews are starting to praise the game for returning to the state it felt like at launch, a fun, ridiculous, intense co-op shooter that didn't make game balance the end-all and be-all. The developers have kept true to their word and have made substantial updates to the game that affect game flow, balancing, and adding fun back to what many deem to be a fumbled bag of a game post-release. No, the game still isn't perfect, and it never will be, but the developers are still working diligently to make it a game that you and they will want to play for a long time. Making something amazing isn't a solo task. It's a group effort that requires an absurd amount of communication and time. I just want to say that Arrowhead has done an amazing job maintaining Helldivers 2 throughout these last 8 months, because it's genuinely one of the most unique gaming experiences to ever exist. What Helldivers 2 does has not been replicated anywhere else. If you're a fan of the channel, you know I'm not that much of a live service guy, but this one hits where no one else really can. And let's be real, live services are hard. They require a team that's always on the clock, delivering new content, making sure the game stays fresh for years and years. It requires dealing with a vocal community and receiving and iterating on feedback. But if there's one piece of advice I can give to the players, it's this: go easy on these developers. They're clearly a good bunch and are actively working to better the game that you and they love so much. Sure, there will be turns and a handful of bad updates, but that's par for the course for a live service game. The fact that the player base is still so passionate after all these months is a testament to the brilliance of the game's design. Helldivers 2 isn't a dead game. It's far from it, but I also think that the game could use some more regular content updates that bring in players the way Destiny and Fortnite does, like expansions for instance. Updates that massively shake up the formula and add a lot of new things to the gameplay experience. I'm really excited to see where Helldivers 2 goes in the future, both in terms of narrative and gameplay. I'm sure Arrowhead has a lot of amazing stuff cooking in the background, just judging by what we've seen so far with the black hole, as well as the newly introduced Democracy space station that is promising to let players vote to teleport the space station wherever they might need it in the future. It's clear that Arrowhead has a very distinct vision for the game in more ways than one, and plan on supporting it for a long time coming. But there's still that nagging feeling in the back of my brain saying, it's live service, you need to be skeptical. It's a feeling that's very hard to ignore, honestly. I've seen lots of games come and go at the drop of a hat over the years, no matter how supported they were. And Helldivers is a game that lives and dies by the player count. If there aren't enough people playing, the whole concept falls apart. It requires a very active role from both the players and the developers, and if either of those falter, the game is doomed to failure and will be lost to time. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt are all part of the process, and it's okay to feel those things as a player. You've been invested in the game for so long, and you don't want it to disappear. There's no telling how long that might be, but I want to remain positive as I believe that Helldivers 2 is a game that uses live service in an incredibly unique way that deserves to be celebrated for all it does differently. It's a game that I think needs to end on its own terms, not on the terms of apathy. If the game is able to wrap itself up nicely in this tight little package full of surprises and intrigue and end with a story to tell, then I think it will all be worth it in the long run. As long as it's still playable once it goes offline, that is. So here's to more Helldivers and to more democracy. We're 4 months away from a 1-year anniversary and the universe is waiting for us. Now let's get back out there. We've got some bots to break and bugs to splatter. Hey, thanks for making it to the end of the video. Helldivers is a really special game, and I'm glad I got to document its early months for posterity. It's a game that deserves all of the success it has received, and also deserves to be thoroughly examined in a time where games just don't seem to be hitting like they're supposed to, especially live service ones. Huge shout out to my channel members listed here. I wouldn't be making videos today without these fine folks. And an extra special thank you goes to my $3 channel members who are Cilantro and the Windigod. If you would like to join these fine folks in supporting me and what I do here, you can do so by clicking the join button down below next to the like and subscribe buttons. Diablo 4 Vessel of Hatred is right around the corner, but I won't be able to tackle it until later in the month as I have one more video planned to release before then. Please keep an eye on your subscription feed for when that does drop, and as always, this has been Testing Triangles. Thanks for diving